and welcome to this week's episode of the Career Coven. This week, we're having another conversation with a guest expert, and the expert this week is someone called Sebastian or Seb Agertoft. He is a professional career coach, and he was actually my professional coach. And in this conversation between him and Bec, they discuss what it means to be a coach, what coaching is, and who it can benefit. They also talk about different styles of coaching and when certain styles might be more useful than others. And there's also advice for people looking to start coaching or become a coach, as well as advice for people who are looking to work with a coach. Now, both Bec and I have had different coaches throughout our careers to date, and we have found coaching to be a really, really useful tool. It is something that not everyone can access, and we understand that, but it's also something that you may be able to ask your employer about if you're at a particular stage in your career and looking to make the next step. So we thought that a deep dive into what coaching is and how it helps people would be really, really useful for listeners of the Career Coven. And we look forward to hearing what you think about this really honest conversation between Seb and Bec.
Hi, Seb. Lovely to meet you.
Bec, pleasure. Great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. I've heard so much about you from Annie, obviously as your coaching client, and we thought we would have you here today because we have both had a lot of coaching during our careers. We found it incredibly helpful, but we've had some listeners say they don't know anything about it. So we thought you might be a great person to help our listeners in understanding everything about coaching and also your experience as a coach and transitioning into that. So we're so delighted to have you here. Shall we start with an introduction by yourself? And perhaps the first question is, what is coaching?
Yeah, great question. I'll give a abridged intro to me, which is I'm Seb, and my background prior to coaching was generally as in startups in product roles. I worked mostly at the sort of startup and scale up phase, although did spend a little bit of time at eBay historically as well, so I have a bit of big company experience. Ended up most recently in a kind of VP of product role in a very high growth health tech company. So yeah, had my own journey as a sort of startup operator and then leader before I sort of pivoted my career into coaching a couple of years ago. As to your question about what is coaching, it's not a regulated term, the word coach. So I think that's like an important thing to call out, versus say a psychologist or a psychiatrist, etc. So what that means is it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and there can be many different things happening under the umbrella of coaching. Um, if we're talking about one-to-one coaches, then most what I would think of as legit coaches lie essentially, in my mind, on a spectrum between sort of business advisor at one end and essentially therapist at the other, and they're kind of somewhere that sits along that spectrum. But there are also a lot of charlatans out there as well. So, yeah, lots of weird and wonderful things that happen under the banner of coaching. So whilst I believe that, yeah, coaching can consist of a lot of different things, for me, the kind of core common themes that lie at the heart of the coaching relationship are that it is oriented towards the client. Most of our relationships in the world, like there's at least some sense that they should be 50-50, that we each carry our part of the conversation and etc. But this is very much oriented towards the client rather than the coach. Secondly, it's non-judgmental, which so important. Also very rare. Even those people who are your friends, your family, your loved ones, might be great at being generally not judgmental, but they also have some stake in the game, even if they don't think they do. Right? They normally have some kind of ulterior motive. So it's very much a non-judgmental space. And then the third factor is it's typically focused on helping the client make some sort of change in sort of work or life. And that can be pretty broad. But yeah, those are the sort of three core themes I would say that underlie a good coaching relationship in my view.
Amazing. And when we're talking about a kind of coaching relationship, is this something that our listeners would expect would go on forever? Is it time bound? Like, what does the structure of that relationship look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are different philosophies out there, and different coaches and clients look for different things. So there is some folks out there who would say that a coaching relationship should be sort of time bound and quite specific. I take a slightly different view in the sense that I think a coaching relationship should always have a clear set of sort of goals, and I kind of think about coaching relationships and coaching sort of time periods as sort of being driven by a bit of a narrative arc. So it's almost like, what's the narrative arc that we're working on together here? Like, where are we really trying to get you to? But then, of course, life happens, work happens, things change. So often I might work with a client for 6 months and that narrative arc is going in one direction. And maybe we get there, or maybe circumstances change and they want to continue to work together for that new chapter. So, yeah, I would say can be very sort of short term in some cases, can be much longer term. Um, I'd say rather than the time bound thing, I think it's having a clear kind of direction that you're moving in is the most important aspect there.
Super interesting. And in terms of how often a person speaks to their coach, is there a set kind of best practice frequency, or is that really dependent on your relationship?
It depends on your relationship. Frankly, it depends on the coach. It also depends on the sort of premium you're paying for coaching, etc. So there are coaches out there for whom their structure and the way they work is sort of, we have a conversation, and then outside of that conversation, for want of a better phrase, like, you're dead to me, right? It's like, I'm speaking to you, and when I'm not speaking to you, then like you're not on my radar. For me, I don't really like that model. So I tend to structure, like, for my clients, I typically don't take on any clients for less than a 6-month period, and I kind of operate like an always on sort of model. So that normally means we have a set cadence every 1 to 2 weeks of sort of sessions, and that is almost like the heartbeat of the relationship. But then outside of those conversations, I am there to support the client, whether it means they've had a terrible day and had some bombshell dropped on them, and they're like, can we jump on a call for 30 minutes? Or we might have just some email correspondence and sort of checking in on how the thing we spoke about in the last session is progressing. So yeah, for me, it's a bit more kind of high touch, always on. I would say at a minimum, 2 touch points a month. Any kind of less than that, I feel like it's hard to keep momentum within a coaching relationship. But yeah, there is a broad.
Yeah, I mean, so much happens in a month that you'd spend half the time catching up. So super interesting. So tell us a bit more about your style of coaching and how it might be different from the others.
Sure. So again, going back to what I said before, lots of different things that get called coaching. For me, I tend to do really like two types of coaching. So the first type for me is working one to one, normally with founders and leaders of VC-backed startups. And then for me, the second type is actually working with teams. So that's normally either founding team or an exec and senior leadership team. So of course, across those two areas, the style and approach looks a bit different. But if we focus maybe more on the one-to-one part, it's an interesting question, this notion of style, because I think the truth is, it does look different per client. Part of the skill is, as a coach, is being able to recognize the client in front of you and what they need, and the style or the tools or the techniques, etc., that is going to be most effective to help them sort of unlock the things they need to unlock. So yeah, I would say it's not totally rigid, but if I were to call out again some of the themes. For me, I'd say I'm 90% coaching, 10% advisory.
Mm.
What I mean by that is there are some very like purist coaches out there. Maybe they've never worked in a leadership domain, perhaps, or it's just to do with like their beliefs about coaching, who would never dream of offering like an opinion or anything more like their own perspective into the space. And it's all about like giving the client space to unpack this stuff. Now, I believe in the value of that in a lot of cases, and I think that's incredibly powerful. But I also think sometimes, like, if you can see a client sort of driving towards a cliff edge at 100 miles an hour, and you know that like there are things that then there's a certain either some experiences you've had, some tools or things that you think would be valuable, or sometimes it's just like naming that thing, right? Saying, hey, I see you going for the cliff edge. I know you think this is a good plan, but I'm a little bit worried on your behalf, like based on some other things I've seen or based on my knowledge of you. So yeah, much more coaching than I am advisory, but I am willing to bring a bit of that like advisory piece in where it's relevant and yeah, based on my previous experience.
I think one thing that I just want to pause there for a second, I have found really helpful in my experience of being coached is exactly as you said, when a coach kind of identifies and almost holds up a mirror to or kind of observes you doing something and plays that back to you. Because I think often when you're being coached, one of the greatest challenges is when you're in the workplace, having self-awareness about what's actually going on for you and like kind of what that looks like objectively.
Mm.
And you won't ever get that answer from anyone honestly, really. So I find that really helpful. Although I think there's also maybe a duty of care in coaching somewhat, that if you see something is about to go really wrong, um, perhaps a soft intervention might be helpful.
Yeah, exactly. I work with my own coach. My own coach is an 80-year-old Zen Buddhist who lives in San Francisco. He actually founded one of the sort of most well-known coaching schools in the US, and he's great. I love him, and he there's sort of this view, this almost this conflict in the coaching world. There's an organization called the ICF who I'm accredited through. It's, I think, a great thing generally, but they are very sort of prescriptive about what coaching is and what coaching isn't. And there are other people who take a different view, and I don't think either of them is sort of right or wrong. It's just different perspectives. And James has this view that there's almost this expectation as a coach that you have to be this totally empty vessel with like no opinion, and you're just there in this sort of facilitating role. And he says to me sometimes, like, I don't want to be an empty vessel. Like, I still have an opinion. If a client comes to me and says my mission in life is to make nuclear arms, he's like, I don't want to just help them do that better. I still have those views. So I think there is some sort of conflict in opinion within the coaching world of how much are you bringing you into the space versus how much are you that kind of empty vessel. And every coach will have a different philosophy and land in a different point there, I would say.
Super interesting. So tell us a bit more about your journey into becoming a coach. Like, how did you decide that was what you wanted to do, and what sort of took you on the pathway of quitting your job and going through this process and now being a full-time coach? I think this is something that Annie and I have discussed at length about coaching ourselves, and I'm sure for a number of our listeners, they'll also be interested. So we'd love to hear the kind of philosophical and practical journey of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are kind of a few threads to this story. I'll try and keep it coherent and relatively brief, but like there's definitely some background context here for people. So the first piece of context here is, like before I became a coach, I was a VP of product for a company called Pelago Health. It's basically focused on providing digital first treatment for substance addiction. I was brought in very early and kind of led all things product. The company raised a lot of money, 150 million in VC funding today,
Wow.
grew to a few hundred people, and was working on like building products that would help people with opioid addiction. And so like on paper, this was kind of a dream job.
Yeah.
And like my journey up until that point, in every product role I'd done, I'd always had this sense of kind of unrest. But there was always something obvious I could point to as to like why the next job might be different and might sort of solve the unrest. And so, I did what most people do, and I kind of carried on that ladder, and then I would get into the next role and I'd think like, yeah, that sort of sense of unrest is still here, but again, maybe it's this thing now that's the problem. And eventually, when I got to sort of the upper rungs, if you like, of that ladder, I still had the unrest, but I was basically running out of excuses. It was like
Mm.
I've sort of done this journey. I've sort of somewhat ignored like some of this sort of internal unrest. Um, and so at some point, I really just started to have honest conversations with myself about what are my motivations in life, what's really important to me. And I remember thinking to myself, and then like fast forwarding on this, product leadership career that was sort of laid out in front of me, and just thinking, like, there is no way I do this and I don't have a midlife crisis. Like I was like, this is, there is just no fathomable path like for me if I stick at this where I don't wake up, whether it's age 40, 50, I don't know, and think this was the wrong path for me. And so there was like a real like facing that and realizing that there was a dissonance between what I was doing and a lot of what I was actually truly motivated by, which was much more people than it was technology. So there was that path in my career. I would say, there are sort of two other threads I would say to this story. The second of which is, for me personally, I'd grown up not spiritual or anything, and like I was not a part of my life. Um, but when I was in my early 20s, my mum ended up in a sort of highly coercive, abusive relationship for a few years.
Oh gosh.
And that for me was kind of a catalyst for going and seeking answers in the world that I didn't feel like, to questions I didn't feel well equipped to answer. So, there's the Steve Jobs quote about like you can only connect the dots looking backwards. And I guess this is one of those situations where at the time that then triggered, I took up yoga. I ended up, after many years, becoming an Ashtanga yoga teacher. From there, I started teaching meditation. I ended up in lots of different, self-exploration and awareness type of spaces and mediums, and just learned a lot on that path. Um, and so that existed for me in tandem with being a startup exec. And for a while, for a long time, I just thought like, oh, these are two parts of my life that are just separate and distinct, and will be forever. um, and then the third thread, I guess, just to sort of, the one about like me and my realizations and some of my interests. The third thread is frankly that leadership in startups is generally a bit of a catastrophe. Like I've been in the industry for a long time. I have lots of friends in similar spaces, and I think we just do a terrible job of preparing people for leadership.
Mm.
Most startups, despite smart people and the best intentions in the world, end up being a massive waste of potential because we just don't equip people to build organizations effectively for the long term. So all of those things really coming together for me, like my own motivations, my sort of interests in other areas, and then also just hyper awareness of the problem of leadership in a lot of startups, they eventually came to a point where they kind of weaved together for me. And that was the point. I said, right, I want to go and start training to be a coach. So I went through my first coaching school whilst I was still a VP of product. I started taking on some clients, and basically the more I did, the more I realized it was the right thing for me to be doing, and the more I felt drawn to that over products. And then there came a point on that journey where it was time to commit, which is what I did.
That's awesome. I also love that you tell the story in a way that is sort of unashamedly complex.
Mm.
Like, I think with all of those decisions and juncture points that you make in your life and your career, there's never one obvious, like, I was just fed up, so I left.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, we dumb down so much like advice and narrative into just like, oh, this is digestible for people. But yeah, the truth for me was like highly messy, highly complex. Like, yeah, connect the dots. You know, I can sit here and tell a somewhat neat narrative in looking backwards, but yeah, it definitely didn't feel that way. You know, living it at the time.
and how do you feel about your unrest now?
Really good. I mean, you know, I'm in terms of starting a business and growing a business, like lots that's been hard that on that road, and yeah, by no means want to portray that as an easy journey, um, but definitely I'm in a great place today, and feel very vindicated in my decisions of yeah,
Amazing.
and that unrest is yeah, certainly quietened down.
So I think, I mean, that's absolutely brilliant, and you touched on my next question already, which was going to be around, for someone who's worked kind of in a job before, that, you know, is employed by someone else and you get a salary from someone else. How did that process feel for you, of going from that environment to, you know, I am in charge of my financial destiny and my own business? How was that transition for you, and what did you learn?
Um, Really fucking scary. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. We can edit it out if needed. But no, like it really scary, really scary. It's a hard work, you know, hard world to sort of take yourself out of that security that you know that you've known, and just the idea that a certain amount of money that you know what it is going to hit your account on a certain date is a big mental adjustment. Um, so for me, you know, I was thinking about this earlier, and I think broadly there have kind of been three phases. Um, so the first phase was what I refer to as the oh shit phase, which is basically everything's new. You know, you realize you have no real idea how to build a business. You feel overwhelmed, and then when you're a coach, you simultaneously feel overwhelmed, but you can't show that you're overwhelmed because you're a coach, and you know you're meant to have your shit together basically. So you're sort of, there's this weird disconnect going on where you feel like you have to portray that you have everything together, even though it's incredibly overwhelming. Then from the oh shit phase, I went into what I think of as kind of more the grind phase, where you know the initial overwhelm has sort of passed, but there is just the realities of now I've got to show up day in, day out and motivate myself and run this business without any imposed structure on me. And you know, in my case, like, oh, it's kind of working, but it feels hard. There's a sense of like, does it get easier than this? You know, um, and then the third phase, which I'm hoping is either here to stay or will, you know, I'll get to an even better phase. But it is what I think of as like the payoff phase, which is, you know, for me, I hit a point where you know I'd established a good reputation, um, and off the back of that, you know, you start to get more and more business is sort of coming your way, like inbound versus having to sort of seek it out there in the world. Um, as well as, yeah, for me moving more into some areas of like team coaching, etc. So things start to like really come together on that front, or they did for me. And then with that, I've become much better at then capitalizing on the flexibility that comes with working for myself, which, you know, for a long time is like, oh yeah, it's this great selling point, but it's easy to sort of have it there and not use it when you're so focused on, oh, I've got to get this thing off the ground. Um, yeah, it's another thing to actually capitalize on it and genuinely enjoy it, and take that space for yourself and feel okay about that.
Well, in one of your emails to me, you said you'd been in the mountains, which sounds like a good use of flexibility from my
Indeed.
perspective.
Yeah. I was yeah, lucky to do. I did a week long hike with my dad in the mountains this year, and like that was one of. I set myself 3 goals this year, and one of them was have more fun, and that was one of the things I wanted to do. So yeah, that kind of thing, and being able to like really throw yourself into it and not feel guilty about not working.
I love that. And just in terms of how you manage yourself in this business, is there a sort of cap on the number of clients that you take, or a kind of do you put in a structure for your week on kind of your boundaries around how much work you're doing, or what does managing yourself look like in this context?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think for me, truthfully, I oscillate between phases where I feel like I give myself more structure, and then phases where I'm a bit more give myself a bit more space. And I, for a time, felt like in that sort of debate between structure and space, I was trying to find a right answer. And I think what I've learned for me is actually I do just benefit from being able to oscillate between those different modes at different times of year, different like other things I've got going on. So yeah, I have a sort of broad sense across, say, the one-to-one clients and some of the like team coaching of what mix I ideally want to have there, and I'm pretty clear these days on the types of clients I take on and those who aren't a right fit for me. Um, I try to have a sort of bit of structure around my week and certain things that I do consistently do at certain times of week. Um, but yeah, but also yeah, have some times like we spent, my wife and I are lucky enough to both have a bit of flexibility, so we tend to spend a couple of months of the year in southwest France.
Ooh,
I love to surf, so like we were out there in May and June, and I kind of said to myself like I'm gonna orientate my week so that I basically do a 4-day week whilst I'm here, and I'm gonna spend a bit of time surfing, and that was amazing. And then when we came back, I kind of upped my workload a bit, and was probably working a bit longer hours. So yeah, it's a constant. Um, and battle's maybe the wrong word, but it's having that self-awareness that you preach to and teach to your clients. And as I say before, I work with my own coach, so for me having that same kind of mirror, that same space to be asking myself some of these questions is really beneficial in that process.
yeah. I mean, it sounds like quite an intuitive approach to how you structure your time, and in a kind of, I work in a corporate environment. There are just peaks and troughs throughout the year anyway. So I suppose it's probably completely natural to have peaks and troughs when you're just when you're in full control of of your workload as well. Super interesting. So, what would you recommend for anyone interested in becoming a coach? What would be the first kind of steps or things they should be doing or thinking about?
Yeah. So good question. I think the first thing I would say is get in the game. And what I mean by that is pick a training, whether that's a short form intro, whether that's something, up to you, but go and start getting exposed to coaching, getting hands on with it, and learn if it's really something that you want to do. I think that in and of itself, for some people, will be, light this fire within them, and they'll be like, yes, I love this. I think for other people, they maybe think of coaching and they think of all the lifestyle around it that they think they might be able to lead, more so than the act itself. And for most people who come from more of a typical job, coaching is really different, and you take on a lot of emotional burden of a lot of
Mm,
people. It's a very different way to orientate your work. So yeah, I think there's no real way to answer that, whether it's right for you, without just getting in the game. And even if you get in the game and you decide it's not the right thing for you to do long term, learning great coaching skills is something that will serve you in every aspect of life, whether it's work, your marriage, or whatever. Like it'll teach you to be a better listener, it'll teach you to engage with people. So it will never, I don't think, prove, if you go to a good training, to be a waste of money, even if you don't turn it into your lifelong career. The other thing I would say is whatever you're doing now is, build your network, and, don't do that in a slimy, networky kind of way, but just be out there in the world, finding opportunities to help other people, connect with other people, do it authentically, and try to build, you know, a network based on, trust and integrity with good people. Because if you do end up trying to become a coach, the hardest part of the journey is that early part, and probably success or failure for you is going to hinge on the strength of that network in the early phase. So, that is, if you don't plan to make the jump tomorrow, but you're looking at it as like a long-term time horizon, there's a lot you can be doing to build that network, and set yourself up for future success.
Such a good point. I mean, your reputation is everything amongst the people you know, and I assume, is it fair to say, Seb, that probably quite a lot of coaching business comes from referrals or word of mouth?
Hugely so. Yeah. I mean, early on, you're kind of out there in the world trying to let people know about what you're doing, and there's a lot more kind of a sense of you being outbound. For me now, yeah, a large part of my business basically comes from referrals from current and past clients, or referrals from organizations where you have good relationships. So I
Mm.
have a bunch of relationships with venture capital companies, for example, where I've maybe worked with a founder in the portfolio. So yeah, if you can build that credibility, build that genuine connection, and build that trust, then that will stand you in great stead.
Yeah, totally. You said something else earlier in your response, and it's actually the second time you've mentioned it, and I kind of wanted to unpick it a little bit.
Mm.
You mentioned that there's a kind of emotional burden. Well, I don't know if you use the word burden, but you are the recipient, and kind of you're holding space for other people's emotions and thoughts of them. And as your coach says, well, you're a vessel. You might not be empty, but you're you're creating the space for them. Would you say that is a good thing for people who are kind of more emotional in nature, or is that really difficult? How do you balance that as a person taking on all of these kind of challenges and discussions from your clients?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I can already tell back that you'd make a good coach, because you did well to loop back and mirror back from the earlier conversation. The I think different people will sort of handle it differently. I think it comes down to, for some people, that will really drain them, and for other people, it will be a source of great energy to be engaged with people in that way. So for me, I would say, generally speaking, I'm not someone who necessarily loves walking into a room crowded full of people, and like that I find quite draining. I love connecting with people one to one, and so on the whole, you do take on a lot from your clients, but for me personally, it's something that generally feels like it's recharging my batteries rather than draining them. Having said that, you will also come across a lot of serious things when you're in the coaching space, and people will tell you things that they've never told anybody else in the world. And I think firstly you need to have the skills and the training, etc., to know how to handle that delicately and skillfully.
Mm.
Secondly, you need to be able to afford yourself the same space that you afford others, and you know be compassionate with yourself, make sure that you're doing the things that like de-stress you, etc. And so don't you treat yourself as this sort of special case who's somehow like immune to all of the stresses of the world. Right, you need to practice what you preach. So yeah, it can be hard, but I think, yeah, broadly some people are kind of more energized by that form of engagement, other people are drained.
It was an interesting point you were making there around walking into a room of people that you have to talk to versus one to one. Would you classify yourself as an introvert or an extrovert?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in all of the kind of like Myers-Briggs type of tests, there's tons of
Yeah.
tests out there. I'm someone who sits on this like ambivert, where I can show up in those spaces and put on a good show. Like people I can talk in front of a room of people in hopefully a fairly compelling way, and people would think of me as being an extrovert, but then I'd go home and need to like lie on the sofa for a day, you know. So, um, so yeah, I'm a kind of, you know, a weird mix. I'm sure many other people can relate to that as well. So
Yeah, I agree. I'm outwardly presenting extroverted when I need to be, but it's very, very tiring. Um, Good to know. I want to kind of change gears on this conversation slightly and look at it more from this perspective of, for our listeners who maybe haven't had a coach and they're thinking about getting a coach. Um, uh, is there kind of a particular point or area in someone's life when you think they might need coaching or benefit more from coaching? And then second part of the question is, and how would they go about finding one?
yeah. So it is a good question, and like any question, you know, I'd say there's no definitive right or wrong. For me, I focus a lot with my clients on those what I call navigating firsts, and so often it's a first time founder, first time exec, um, and that point or that type of client, there is often the greatest delta between like the needs of the role and the situation, and then kind of what they're equipped to handle at that point in time. So where those big kind of deltas exist, I think is one way to think about it. You know, when you're really early in your career, like we're all a bit clueless. But then we're rightly like given less responsibility whilst we figure out a bit of that cluelessness. And then from there, you know, if you rise through the ranks quickly, or maybe you become a founder yourself, um, people can quickly end up in that like high stakes position where they just simply aren't that well set up to succeed, end up feeling overwhelmed, etc. So that tends to be the area I focus on. Um, and I guess the other thing to say there is it can happen at any age, but if you were going to kind of look at like age demographic, the timing of all of that stuff can also often coincide with starting a family and like these other kind of big strenuous adventures in life. So it can like really compound for people, you know, that they've got so many kind of draws on their time and their energy. Um, so yeah, that's where I focus most. But you know, for me, it's not exclusively that, and I'd say there's no necessary bad time. It's generally, you know, oriented towards change. So when people are figuring out that this is a point in time where I'm really seeking change, maybe I want to pivot to a new career, maybe I just want to find a new role, maybe I want to find out how to better succeed in my role currently. Maybe it's a much more broad life aspect about the way I think about the world. So yeah, no bad time, but yeah, for me it's a lot about that delta between what is your role and the situation demanding of you versus what are you set up to do, basically.
Great. I mean, every time I've had coaching has been when I've been in a almost in a transition period, or where I know that something is not quite working out, but I can't put my finger on why. And I found it really helpful to then work out what my next step is. I mean, it was interesting that you say that coaching can tend to happen around other big life events. The last coaching bit I had was I was very early pregnant and was working out how to navigate that with work with a coach, and then we ended up talking about where I was going to live, and it was
Mm.
like not a direction that I expected, but we obviously can't take an individual's role and job in isolation of all of the other really big things that are going on, because we're all just messy, complicated people with other things outside work. So that really struck a chord for me. So let's assume that a listener wants to get coaching. They kind of recognize something in themselves about a place they want to get to, or a change they want to make, or something like that. If they want to find a coach, how would they go about that, and what do you think they should be looking for? Because I feel like chemistry is quite important in a kind of coaching relationship.
Yeah, it definitely is. So I would say first and foremost, get some recommendations. That might be people in your network. That might be, if you're a founder, that might be your VC investors, for example. Most of us will have people around us who have engaged with coaching and know some people who they trust and they value. I'd say from there, speak to a few different coaches. Any decent coach is going to be willing to connect with you and take some time for an initial conversation without charging you any money. So go and speak to a few of those options. Um, be aware that pricing can vary very significantly in this space. So I'd say don't shy away from the money conversation early in that process. People can feel uncomfortable about it, but just be transparent about how you're thinking about budget, etc. And your search will probably be much more efficient that way. Um, and then in terms of the coach themselves, things like coaching credentials are relevant and somewhat important, but I'd say more so, does that coach have experience of working with clients like you? Is that their bread and butter, or are you falling in the bucket of a tiny thing they do on the side? And probably most importantly, pay attention to your energy and how you feel after speaking with each person. You're kind of inviting this person into your life as a thought partner, a catalyst for change. So did that conversation provoke something new for you in terms of how you're thinking, how you're feeling? And I would view it through that lens, because you need fit and you need chemistry, but there's a risk, I think, for all of us when we go and seek a coach, is we look for someone who basically looks like us and is going to have
Mm.
the same views of the world. So just remember that you're there. There's something that you want to change, so don't necessarily base it just on who you like and you could imagine yourself having a drink down the pub with. It's like, has this person provoked something new for me, even based on an initial conversation? And I think if you can answer that honestly off a few different conversations with different coaches, you'll probably end up with a fairly clear sense of yes, that person feels like the right fit for me right now.
Super interesting. I think, yeah, I've had quite a few coaches for different reasons at different times, and I had one coach who was just sort of demographically so far off me, and actually, those conversations were, I'd argue, the most provoking, in that you're like, this is just someone telling me something quite surreal about myself that
Mm.
if I'm coaching myself, I would never do. So I think it's really fascinating. You touched on a really good point there about pay, and I think some of our listeners are at the start of their career, or don't have a huge amount of disposable income, and I think in the UK, my assumption is the kind of base rate of what you would get out in the market probably wouldn't be under £100 per session for coaching. So for some of our listeners, that might not be affordable. What would you recommend that those listeners do if they couldn't afford one-to-one coaching? Is there anything that they can think about, or is there any kind of content they can consume? What would you recommend to those guys?
Yeah, it's a great point, because coaching is a sort of premium thing generally that isn't widely accessible to everybody. Um, I think there's an interesting thing here about what role AI plays in that in the future.
Mm.
But yeah, I think the first thing on the affordability is firstly to ask yourself honestly, is that true? Can I not afford this? And that might be genuinely true. For other people, what you will see is they certainly have the money, but what they struggle to do is prioritize investing that money in themselves. So for a lot of people, that is more the barrier than money. It's oh, is it can I spend that money on me? Can I invest in me in that way? So I think there's an honest conversation to have with yourself about is it true that it's not affordable for me? If the true answer to that is, yeah, it's not affordable for me right now, which will be the answer for many. See what options you have available through your company.
Mm.
So, you know, earlier in your career, it's probably less likely. Most companies, I would say these days, will fund some sort of coaching at a leadership level, but yeah, often not lower down the org. But some do. There are some organizations who will work with the kind of large platform providers, and you might be able to get a sort of 6 sessions or some kind of package through your company. So definitely explore that as an option. If that's not on the table, I would say there is potential to get free coaching sometimes from those coaches who are training. There's a
Yeah.
lot of people training to be coaches these days, and depending on the circumstances, I probably wouldn't go to a coaching training if I had a 10 out of 10 critical huge issue, because by nature they're less experienced. But if it's like, hey, there's some stuff I'd like to work through, I would benefit from that sort of thought partnership. Then you can basically find, I forget off the top of my head, but maybe I can send it to you afterwards and put it in show notes or whatever. But there are some organizations that I think help connect people looking for free coaching with coaches in training looking for test clients, basically. So that could be a really interesting option to explore. And then the other thing is, like, again, if none of that is right for you, I'm not someone who is an advocate of like everyone should do coaching all of the time. I think like sometimes it's not right for people for a range
Yeah.
of reasons, and that's totally fine. There are a lot of different tools out there that help with some of the underlying themes you might be working on. So if it's about self-awareness, maybe you start journaling, maybe you pick up a meditation practice through one of the many apps out there. There are different entry points into some of these topics, that can come at a lower price point. So explore some of those areas, perhaps as a starting point, and maybe they will be the thing that help you sort of solve that problem without the need of a coach whatsoever.
Gosh, if only journaling can solve everything. I do believe journaling can solve a lot, though. I have one last question for you before we wrap this up. For someone who's going into a coaching relationship and they haven't been coached before, is there anything that you would recommend that they go into that session with in terms of mindset or anything else?
Yeah. I think the important thing in a coaching relationship is, at least the way I think about it, is it's sort of co-created by coach and client. And some people might think, well, when I find a coach, in essence, I'm sort of outsourcing the problem to someone else. This coach is like an expert, they're going to solve it for me. Like, that is not what's happening. And if someone's telling you that's what's happening, I would run a mile. So you are there both committed to the ongoing process of change for you as you define it. So I would say, turn up open-minded, ready to explore, knowing that the conversation itself might be great and it might unlock a load of new thoughts for you, but you're probably going to have to go back into the world and do something about those new thoughts in order for it to meaningfully change your life. If you just sit on them, then there's only so much change that might happen. So yeah, I'd say turn up with that in mind. Turn up ready to steer the conversation where you want to take it, and think about like what are the things that could change in life that would be most impactful for me. So yeah, be a driver in the relationship, not a passenger. And yeah, the other thing I would say is be compassionate with yourself. I think we all fall into the trap of holding ourselves to different standards than the standards we hold others to often. So just, hopefully by the fact that you've invested in coaching, there's like some belief there or some willingness to sort of be compassionate with yourself. and try to take that into the coaching process. You know, you're not going to have this linear journey from where you are now to, you know, this mythical world in which everything is great all of the time, but you're taking steps. You're willing to put time and effort into improving things, and sometimes that will happen very quickly. Sometimes it will take time. Sometimes you'll take a step back. So just be compassionate with yourself and keep showing up and doing the work.
Gosh, what a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much, Seb, for joining us and for giving so much of your wisdom. I'm sure the listeners will agree with me that that was a fascinating conversation. So really delighted. We will link to Seb's website in the show notes, as well as some other reference points that we have discussed today. But thank you so much all for joining us, and have a great day.
Thanks, Bec.